Hello, this is the Ramblings of an Indisciplined Mind podcast for Friday, July 29th, 2016. As of this recording, Sierra is still missing. So, what I thought I'd talk about today is a book I recently finished from the library. Ancillary Justice was the title, by Ann Leckie. I think I'm saying that right, Leckie. And I went to remind myself exactly what this book's relationship to the Hugos was, because I know it was at least nominated as part of my Hugo series, and I was rather surprised. I started off looking at this year's, which are going to get announced next month, actually. And then I looked at 2015, and then I looked at 2014. So here's what I found. Ancillary Justice, the book that I'm going to talk about today, won the Hugo for 2014. The next book, which I believe is Ancillary Sword, was nominated but did not win for 2015. And then the third book, I'm a little fuzzy on the second and third as far as, I may have the order switched, but I think the third book is Ancillary Mercy. Guess what? Up for nomination for this year's Hugo. So this is a strong series. And it's being recognized for that fact. I don't know, I haven't looked to see how typical it is for multiple volumes of a given series to be nominated for the Hugo. Personally, I gotta think that's probably kind of rare. I gotta think, but I don't know. So, Ancillary Justice. It's a very interesting book. I enjoyed it very much, and given the showing of the other two, I'm going to have to read those. I know that the second book, which once again I think it's Ancillary Sword, that my library has that, so I have to get that. I'm not sure they got the third one yet. I may have to find an alternate means of reading that. But Ancillary Justice takes place on two different timelines. And it's a really interesting world. So you've got this, I don't even know what to call it, but you've got this vast interstellar civilization, which is called the Radich. That's how I pronounce it. Radch, I think is how she spelled it. And they basically, they find new civilizations and then they assimilate them. They conquer them. They make them part of the Radich Empire. And there's a specific name for it that I don't recall necessarily. And you have to then, you're part of that empire. So in a sense, it's like a bit like Rome when they were in their conquering phase. I also got a little bit of a vibe from, if you've ever seen the Chronicles of Riddick, where the necromongers went from world to world, only they were basically going to destroy. But there are some similarities there with that, if you're familiar with that series. And I'll get to that. So, it starts off, the first one timeline is taking place during one of these, I think they called it annexation, perhaps. I believe that was what they called it. And that was basically when, we're taking your planet and we're annexing it to our civilization. And of course, it's a big military push followed by a civil push. You're under like martial law for a goodly amount of time after that. And so in this first, there's kind of an earlier timeline and a later timeline. So in the earlier timeline, we're going through one of these annexations at this one place, at this one planet, and it's kind of in the after. So it's after the fighting's over, and now we're into the civil governance and dealing with all the crap there that you have to deal with. And then the second timeline takes place quite some time after that. I think it was like 20, 25 years or so after that. And there is just a single person who goes by the name of Brecht. And once again, my pronunciation, it may sound different to you when you read the book. My pronunciation is going to be a bit off. But she's kind of off doing her own thing, and she has got a personal mission, and that is to kill the ruler of this empire. You find out fairly early on that she used to be a ship. And if that isn't strange enough, it's that she's a she. So there's a number of really interesting things. So first of all, there are some of the languages that the people are speaking. Now, you're reading this all in English, but they identify if they're speaking this language or that language. Some of them where gender identification is really important. And the character of this Brecht tended to get them wrong. There was another language where it seemed like the default identification was she. And so it did feel like, or I tended to associate in my head that seemed to be the dominant one. So basically, you never really had a good feel for what the gender of any given person was. And yeah, that was fine. In fact, I tended to, because the she was used so much, I tended to think of everybody as female. And the other thing that was interesting was when you're dealing with the prior time frame, this character was the ship. It was an AI, and the AIs were named after the ship, and the ship's name was the Justice of Torin. So the warships had names like Justice of whatever. There were a number of Justice ofs. He had a couple ships that were Mercy of, and those were like, messenger ships or humanitarian ships, and basically non-war ships. And so the AI was in charge of the ship, but also in charge of the ancillaries. And this is where things get really interesting. So if your system is annexed and maybe you were deemed to be, dangerous, or you were fighting against them or captured or whatever, then you became an ancillary. And what that meant was that, I don't know if they wiped the mind, I think they pretty much did, but you became a meat puppet for the AI. And they had thousands of these ancillary bodies frozen on the ship. And so then as ancillaries were needed, they would thaw some out. Now, there were always a bunch of them running around because there were different I guess you call them military units, and they had different designations. So like there was this one that was called ESK, E-S-K, and then there were a bunch of different ancillaries that were part of the ESK team, and they had numbers. Started off with ESK-1 going on through ESK whatever. As one of the interesting things that she did in the story is there was a lot of times when something's going on down the planet, and there were all these ancillaries that were in their various places, and she would show it's all the same AI that was running it, and they were all linked. And she would show how, this one sees this, and then I saw this, and then I saw this from all these different perspectives. But she did it really well. I was really impressed. I'm somebody who's, in the Borrowed Time series, I've struggled sometimes to manage 2 or maybe 3 copies of Nest as far as how do I want to describe that. And she really did it well. She really did a good job with that, because I was never confused which copy was I looking out of. And the important thing is that which copy wasn't really all that important. The important thing is this ancillary that was down here by the docks gave you a particular perspective, and one that was up on the good side of the town gave you a slightly different perspective, and that enabled the AI to get a complete perspective of what was going on. And then over the course of the story, so you're flip-flopping back and forth between the early timeline and the later timeline. In the later timeline, this Brecht character, we find out later was one of the esque ancillaries, comes across this former lieutenant that she actually, as an AI, she actually didn't really like very well, but she kind of finds her, out in the cold, totally drunk, and probably would have died there, and for reasons that aren't totally clear to her, saves her. Gets her back to health because she was like addicted to some sort of a narcotic that they had there. Nothing like not one that specifically we have a similarity to. So I gotta say, I don't want to get too much into the story because I don't want to spoil it. But it was interesting, and it got even more interesting because later on the ruler, the one that Brecht wants to kill, appears, and there's multiple copies of her. And that's when things really kind of ramp up, and you've got a really, opens up to a really more complex set of conflicts that yet are kept very understandable, and I think that's part of the reason why it's nominated for the Hugo, because you start off, you've got Brecht, and you've got the storyline where you're following what's going on with the Justice of Torn, and at the very beginning you don't know that they're one and the same, and relatively early on you find out that okay, there's a linkage there, and then it gets more and more complex as the story goes on, but yet I didn't find it confusing in the slightest. It was very, it pulled me along with it, and it kept me, so I was understanding everything that was going on, which is good. I mean, and this is a story where, because events in the prior timeline are going to relate to the character in the later timeline. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of gaps, a lot of questions that you have as you're reading it, and bit by bit she fills those in. At the same time, while you still have the questions, you can understand what's going on. So it was a really well-written book. And if the other two are as well-written, and given their placement on the Hugo list, I have no reason to doubt that is not the case, or doubt that is the case. I don't want to do a double negative thing there. They should be very good reads. So if you're looking for some good military sci-fi, there's a bit of military. I mean, it has a military feel to it, but there's not a lot of space battles and stuff, which is what you typically associate with military sci-fi. But it's definitely got that kind of militaristic feel, a little bit of that Chronicles of Riddick Necromonger thing going on there with the ancillaries, and a really good storyline. Even though it's in 3 books, and even though, the story didn't totally conclude, it did wrap up enough that it was its own arc, I think. It did leave a number of things open for the future books, and so I'm looking forward to diving into those. But I felt like when I finished, it wasn't one of those ones where you finish it and you're going like, well, crap, this really didn't resolve anything. It's just, the lead into the next book. I didn't feel like that at all. So it was enjoyable. I would recommend it. Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie, Leckie. So pick it up at your local library. But I'm going to let that be that for today. I will be back tomorrow. I'll be talking to you then. So, be seeing you.